Okay, so today we're talking about promises. If you haven't watched my videos on asynchronous programming or callbacks, you may want to watch those first. If not, you should still be able to follow along, but you may get more out of this video if you have seen those. So promises, what are they used for? So like callbacks, uh, promises are a way to handle asynchronous programs, which is basically whenever there is a chunk of my program that's going to be happening now and a chunk that's going to be happening later. How do we deal with the fact that there is going to be a gap there? And promises are one way to do that. So callbacks are also a way to do that. So why would you use promises over callbacks? Because for any situation where you could use promises, you could also use callbacks. And promises solve two problems. So compared to callbacks, callbacks are not trustworthy, meaning that when you pass a callback into another function, you can't be sure how many times that callback is going to be called. You're not sure if that callback is ever going to be called. There's just a lot of problems with error handling as well. So callbacks generally are not trustable unless you do a lot of defensive coding to make sure that you know exactly how your callback is going to be handled. The other thing is readability. Callbacks in general are a little bit difficult to follow, just because of the nature of the fact that you're passing in another function to an already existing function. But we're going to kind of address both in this video and show why promises are superior. So let's first look at the problem of trustability and why promises are so superior to callbacks in that respect. So the main reason that promises are more trustable is it has to do with what the actual program does once it's done waiting for something. So with callbacks, you basically pass over a chunk of your code to some other function to run, and you're just hoping that that function runs it in a way that you would expect. With promises, that isn't the case. With promises, you're told when the wait is finished, and you have the ability to decide what to do next. So you never pass off a chunk of your code to another source that may or may not run it the way you would expect. You keep control of your program for the entire time because you have the ability of just knowing when something's ready to proceed. Like if I make a call to an outside resource or a request to an outside server, I'll have the ability to know when that data is back and ready to be used, and I can then proceed from there. So this is the API for promises. So this is how you initialize a new promise and then use it. The source of this is David Walsh, who this is the web address if you wanted to look at his blog post on promises. There's some stuff here that is not necessary, but is helpful. Like he assigns the promise to a variable here, which you don't necessarily have to do. You could just work directly off the promise. But let's just kind of take a general overview of how promises are both initialized and used. This is probably the biggest hurdle for using promises because it's very formulaic in how you have to first initialize a promise and then how it's used. And it's not very intuitive, so you kind of just have to memorize this like a formula in math. But once you get the hang of it, it's not so bad. And we're going to do an example here in a moment that should make it a little easier. So the first thing you do is you initialize the promise. You call new on the promise object, and in this call to promise, you pass in usually an anonymous function, with which itself has two callbacks in it, so resolve and reject. So you're not getting away from callbacks, you're just using them in a way that's more trustable and readable. So from that point, it does some asynchronous tasks, so it makes a call to an outside resource, and then if it gets a response that it expects, so if it gets the data back that it's waiting for, you call resolve, and you can either send a message or pass in the data or not pass in anything. That just resolve just means you got back what you expected to get back. Or if there was some issue with your request or the asynchronous action that you're trying to take, you call reject and you pass along a message or an error message that's passed back from the asynchronous call that you made. So once we've initialized the promise, we then have this then method that we can call onto it. So this promise here has been assigned to this variable p. So this p has a method on it, this promise has a method on it called then. So once all of this is done, I can then call the then method, and the then method takes two callback functions itself. The first one is if you got back this resolve, you then do something after that resolve function is called. There's another callback that this could take, which would be to do something if something happened that was unexpected, if there was an error, to handle that error. It's not shown here, but we're going to do it in our example. And then finally, there is the catch method. And the catch method only takes one callback, and that's just error handling. All right, so let's actually look at an example, and maybe that'll make this a little bit easier to understand. So, so this is not a promise. This is just an XHR request, so a XML HTTP request. And this we're going to wrap into a promise and then do some things to it after it's been wrapped. So right now, it is making a call to an API. The API is called UI names, and it just passes back some random user data. And we are, if the status, return status is 200, or greater than 200 and less than 300, it means everything went okay with the request and we got back what we wanted, and we're just console logging the surname from the data that we're requesting. If something goes wrong, we're just console error and then showing what happened that was incorrect. So if we look at that in practice, let's see, I have to save this and then reload. Okay, so surname Proka. If we sent it again, there was some error this time. So loop detected. Okay, so if we refresh again, this time no error. Surname Alton, surname Dumont, and so on. So the first thing we're going to do is actually wrap this in a promise, so that instead of just returning data, we're actually returning a promise. So to do that, we have to first start with a new promise. And if you recall, a new promise takes a function as a callback, and that function takes two callback functions itself, resolve and reject. They don't need to be called that, but it's kind of standard practice to do that. It makes it a little more easier to read and understand what you're trying to do with your promise. So now we are just going to, well, let's just pass all of this into the promise. Okay, so now we have to, instead of handling the data here, we're gonna handle the data as part of the then method. So when do we call resolve? Well, we call resolve if everything goes okay. So here in this if statement, if XHR status is greater than 200 and less than 300, that means everything's okay. And instead of console logging the response text here, let's just pass it to the resolve callback function. Okay, and we won't console log it. We'll do that in the then method. And then of course the reject, that's if something goes wrong, and that's what this else statement, or this else conditional here was supposed to catch. So this will be our reject call here. And again, we're just going to pass into it the status text for the rejection. So now that we have this wrapped in a promise, we're not going to see anything on the actual console, and that's because we're not doing anything with the data. We have a promise, but we need to actually do something with that promise. So to do that, we have to use our then method. So off of this promise, I can call then. And remember, then takes two functions, two callback functions. The first one is if everything goes okay. So then data. And this argument that's being passed into this anonymous function, that is the data that we have that we're passing into the resolve callback here. So it's the response text that we're passing in this as data here.
So let's parse that. So we're going to JSON parse data, just so we can access its properties. And then let's actually console log it, just to make sure everything's working okay. So console log data dot surname, because we just want the surname. Okay, so there's some issue here. So let's see. Then function data JSON parse. Let's actually just console log the data first and see if. Okay. Surname. Oh, okay. So I have to actually assign this to a variable. So let parsed equal JSON parsed, and then we're actually going to call parsed surname. Okay, this should work. Okay, so that is the surname that's being called. All right, so just to make this a little bit more readable in the console, let's actually add some text to the beginning of that console log. And now it should be labeled when it comes back surname, and that is the surname. Okay. All right, so that's if everything goes okay, but we don't want this error to just be swallowed. Like if there was some issue on the server when I make a request, I don't want that to be swallowed by my function and not displayed anywhere. So that's what the second anonymous function that gets passed to then is for. So if I were to place another function here, and I'm just gonna adjust this a little bit to make it a little more readable. Okay, so the second function here is if something goes wrong. So we're going to call this variable that we're passing in, or this argument here, error, for error. And remember that this is taking this status text of any error that occurs during the request that we make. So let's just console error that error. Oops. And let's make a mistake in the URL name here on purpose, just to see if we actually get an error. Okay, good. So this is the actual console error that we're logging. As you can see, without me pulling down the drop down, it's not showing anything. So let's add a little text to that as well. So we're just going to say error. And then now if there's an issue, we'll actually get some text there. Okay, so now this works. However, it only works for this particular website. Like if we're making a request to this API, and we want to make this promise more generally usable. So we don't want to have to just hard code a brand new promise every time we want to make a call to a different API. So we're going to now wrap this part into a function. And it's easy enough to do. There is one mistake that's a little bit easy to make, but we will talk about that. So let's call it function request. And it'll take as an argument a URL, because we want to be able to pass in the URL of the API that we're calling. All of this is going to go inside of it. And the one mistake that is easy to make if you're not careful is you need to return this promise. So you need to make sure that you're returning that promise before you work with it. So now if we want to make a request, instead of hard coding in this URL here, we can call the request function and pass any URL to an API we want to call. So let's actually try that out. So now we are going to request, and then I saved the URL up here so that would be easy to retrieve. Let's go ahead and pass that in. And we are still thenning off of this promise that's returned, hopefully, and if I typed everything correct, we should still be working here, and we are. So surname, and there it is. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can continue to then off of this. So these then statements can return a promise that can then be, you can do another then method off of. You can create what's called a chain of thens. But to do that, I need to return something from the callback functions that are being passed into then. So for this one, we want to pass along the surname because we're going to check to see if any books were written by a person of that surname using a completely separate API. So let's return parsed surname. So this is going to be what's passed along to the next then in the chain for the if everything's going correctly, it'll be the first function, the first callback function. So our first callback function, it's being passed a surname. So let's just call it surname. It doesn't really matter what you're calling these because you really just want to focus on making it understandable. So function surname, we are going to now return a request because we want to pass along another promise. So we're going to return a request. This is the request wrapper that we wrote earlier, except now it's going to be to a different API. So instead of putting in the URL we just did for UI names, we are going to be passing in this URL, which is to Open Library. Their search, and as a query here, we are going to pass in an author surname. So let's use the surname that we returned from the previous then. So, and so as of right now, this isn't going to show anything on the console because all we've done is returned it. Like we're going to make the request and we're going to return that request. So we need to then off of that again to actually use it. So this time it's going to be the it will be the books that were written by that author. So let's call it books list, and we're just going to console log that. Oops. So let's console log book list. All right. And let's quick check to make sure everything's working as expected. Okay, so we're getting a list of books here. Now, we just want the number of books that were written by that author, so let's just take a quick glance at the API here. I see that there is a numFound property here. So let's let numbooks equal books list book list dot numFound, and then we're actually going to console log numbooks, the number of books written by that author. And to make it a little bit more understandable as to what's being printed, let's add a little message in front of that. We'll say number of books with this surname author. Okay, so let's check to see how it's working. Surname Perez, number of books with this surname author, and we're getting it undefined here. So, oh, okay, so book list. Okay, so we always have to parse our JSON here so that we can actually access the properties on it. So JSON parse book list, and then we can do the numFound off of that, I believe. let's see. Okay, 0 with this surname. Fox, quite a few. Mackenzie, again, 1,800. This name, there's none. Okay, so it's working as expected. Okay, so now we have a issue, and as you can see here, it was uncaught. And the reason is, with these last two then methods that I used, you can see I didn't pass in a second function. So those errors were uncaught. They were basically just fell through my then statements. And it'll let you do that. It's not incorrect syntax. You can leave off that second function there, but it is always a good idea to be handling your errors as they come up. So it could be as simple as me just adding, well, I could just copy from here, adding this console log error to each statement. And that's better than just leaving it. But there's still a problem. So the last problem that we have here is that these error handling functions here only handle errors from the previous then statement, or from the previous promise. So as we get down to this then statement, if there were any errors inside of this callback function or this callback function, they would be uncaught. Now, I could do this, so I could do another then statement, and as the first callback, I could just pass in undefined, because I'm not passing along any data, so I don't need the first callback, so that's just going to be undefined. And then as a second callback, I could actually have a function to handle the error. So function error, and then just like before, console error. Okay. So I could do this, and that's fine. But because I need this statement here to look like this, because I'm not passing along anything to be handled by a fulfillment callback, there's actually a shortcut in promises. This is, instead of calling then, I would call catch. And with catch, you can skip the step of passing in undefined here. Catch only takes one function as an argument, and that function just handles errors. So there is one final problem here, and that's what happens if there is some kind of error within this catch function itself. And there's really not any way to answer that. Some modern browsers will handle these uncaught errors and still display them on the console. Some won't. But adding another catch statement after it wouldn't solve it, because what if there's a problem with that catch statement? So it's kind of just a fundamental issue with promises, that there's always a chance that your final then or catch method call is going to have an error that's uncaught. You just kind of have to be aware of that and be careful in how you're writing them. So this is pretty verbose and a little hard to follow, but I kind of wanted to not abstract anything away, just so we can get a sense of how promises are called and then how to use them. And kind of a more, I would say, readable way, you might see something more like this. So this is this request function here is a promise, and it's making a call to UI names just like before. But these then statements, instead of having these anonymous function calls, actually have named functions that are they've been defined earlier in the code. So this is more readable, and it gives if somebody was just reading over this code, they could get a pretty good sense of what was happening here. So what this code does is, using that random user data that we were getting before, it actually generates a user. So if I click the new user button, you can see here at the bottom there's a new pixel art portrait that's being displayed, and their country is being displayed here on Google Maps. To do this, it actually makes a call to 4 different APIs. uses the random user's name as a seed to generate their random portrait, their pixelated portrait. And then it makes a call to, so that's a separate API that generates these random portraits. And then it uses the country to make a call to Google's geocoding API to find out the latitude and longitude, and then makes another call to Google's map API to actually display a map of their country. So this is 4 different asynchronous calls here. And you can do that using callbacks, but it would be really hard to follow. But you see here with callbacks, it's actually fairly simple. So it kind of is like human readable. So I make a request to this API, and then I display the user if everything goes okay, or handle the error. Then I get the geo-coordinates of their location, or I handle the error. Then I display the map. And finally, if there was any errors, I catch them. So as you can see, this is way more human readable, especially when some of the implementation's been abstracted away. So if you have any questions, be sure to leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer. If you enjoyed this video or got anything out of it, be sure to like and subscribe, and happy coding.